Thank you for the invitation to speak today. This theory on the 1% is motivated by this work by Alan a little while ago. So this is allele frequency sample in a temperate Drosophila population. And there's two things I want you to take away from this figure. The first is that these alleles are following the seasonal cycle. They're oscillating with about 10% frequency swings, which is quite large, and there's a lot of them. So I'm going to be asking, is this balancing selection, but from a theoretical perspective? So is it plausible that this could be balancing selection, and what sorts of conditions would we need for that to be true? So this is the standard selection model that everyone's probably familiar with. Your frequencies are just multiplied by fitness to get the frequencies in the next generation. And because you multiply by fitnesses in this way, as you go forward in time, the fitness that matters in a fluctuating environment is the geometric mean fitness, so the average of these products over time. And so what this boils down to is that to have stable polymorphism in a fluctuating environment, you need negative frequency dependence in geometric mean fitness. So in other words, it needs to be good, better to be rare than to be common in the geometric mean. So I'm now going to discuss some of the ways you can get this negative frequency dependence. One way that's gotten a bit of attention lately from Michael, who's the next speaker, is called reversal of dominance. And the way it works is as follows. So just a note on my cartoons here. So the happy and the sad is whether you're happy in your environment, and the color of the flies here is their genotype. So the black is a homozygote black allele, the gray is the heterozygote, the white is a homozygote white allele, and you can see that the environment is switching so that they switch between being happy and sad over time. The essence of reversal of dominance is that dominance also fluctuates over time, not just the selection coefficients. And in particular, if you imagine that dominance reverses in such a way that the favored allele is always dominant, you have this situation where the heterozygote is always sort of moderately happy. And because when you multiply fitnesses, it's much better to be moderately okay than to be sometimes very unhappy, the result is that heterozygotes have a large fitness advantage when dominance reverses in this way. And since rare alleles are always present in heterozygotes, that gives you a very strong rarity advantage, and so you have stable polymorphism. This has been called segregation lift in Micah's work. So I'm going to come back to reversal of dominance in a bit. I just want to discuss another way you can get stable polymorphism first. So in the ecology literature, one of the really big things that's been studied is the effects of generational overlap in organisms where a lot of selection happens at the stage of juvenile recruitment. So from an evolutionary genetics perspective, where all we care about is frequencies, this actually fundamentally changes that basic selection equation. So at the top there, that's the selection equation that you're all familiar with. Now if you have adults persisting through time, you sort of split your selection equation into a part of these old fogies sticking around, and the juvenile recruitment part where all of your selection is happening. And this actually fundamentally changes the dynamics in a way that gives you negative frequency dependence. To demonstrate this, I'm going to go through a little cartoon simulation quickly. So this grid represents a population that's at carrying capacity. We're starting in an environment where the black allele is favored, so the happy black fly is there. And so we'll start with some proportion of the adults die at random, then the remaining adults reproduce. Because the white allele is unfavored, I'm going to say it's so unhappy that it can't reproduce at all. So the black flies are going crazy, competing for the available spaces. And so your black allele increases in frequency as you'd expect. However, the white allele hasn't been excluded because some of its adults survived. Now the environment switches, same thing happens, some random adults die, and now the white gets its turn. And at the end of this whole cycle, you've gone from having a rare white allele to having a white allele that's actually in the majority. So this is what's known as the storage effect. And I've kind of gone through this little cartoon, partly to just give you a sense of what that involves, but also to emphasize an important ingredient of the storage effect, which is that I needed to draw a lot of arrows in this diagram. By which I mean that the fitness difference between the two alleles needs to be large in each environment. which in the terminology of this session is that you need strong fluctuating selection for this to give you a stable polymorphism. So I'm going to come back to that in a bit. I'll just briefly comment that this setup here, where I've split the selection equation into sort of a part that doesn't do much and a part that experiences selection, is actually a lot more general than only overlapping generations. You can imagine all sorts of other ways this can happen: dormancies, resting eggs, etc. And the marginal overdominance that Alan mentioned as well can be sort of viewed in this way. And they all have that same property that you need strong selection. So what I mean by strong selection, I'm going to make a bit more precise now. This graph here is it shows the region of stable polymorphism in this case of protection from selection, which is the term I'm using for all of those mechanisms I described here. The axes here are the selection coefficients on the alleles when they're favored. So the x-axis is the selection coefficient favoring the summer allele in the summer. The y-axis is the selection coefficient favoring the winter allele in the winter. And obviously you want a nice broad region of coexistence if this is going to be a mechanism that's actually operating in nature. Because, you know, in principle you can have a balanced polymorphism if the selection coefficients are exactly equal and you know, they happen to not drift out for long enough. But, you know, really you need this nice big region so that you can have slight differences in the effects of the alleles in the two seasons, and the balancing selection will keep them going. So the thing to really notice here is the numbers in the axes. These are very large. That's a 40% selection coefficient at the edge there. And this really shows that, you know, anything lower than about a 10% selection coefficient isn't going to give you stable polymorphism under protection from selection. Now compare this to reversal of dominance, and you have this really nice big broad region of coexistence. You'll see in the, sorry, I should have mentioned that f.5, that's the parameter that I was using for protection. In the case of overlapping generations, that means that half of your adults persist each time step of the model, which is quite high protection. So I haven't been mean for protection from selection. In the reversal of dominance case, I have been kind of mean. I said, this is very modest reversal of dominance. To remind you, a dominance coefficient of 1/2 is no dominance at all. Dominance coefficient of 1 is complete dominance. So 0.6 is very modest reversal of dominance, and you've got this really broad region of coexistence. So what does this mean for understanding multilocus balanced polymorphism in the example I started with in Alan's flow work? So I've done some simulations to kind of illustrate what the implications of this are. So in this case, this is just a simple Wright-Fisher model. I just start off a population that's polymorphic at 100 loci. I randomly select selection coefficients for each environment. The chosen selection coefficients are the blue dots there. And then I just let it run for 7,500 generations, and I see what sticks around. And as expected, and what sticks around is the orange dots on the right there, and you can see their allele frequency dynamics in the figure on the left. So as expected, only alleles with strong, with a strong effect are able to persist because the balancing effect depends on the selection being strong. Reversal of dominance, on the other hand, doesn't care. It stabilizes the big effect stuff, it stabilizes all the riffraff at the bottom, and so you just get this crazy amount of polymorphism. So that seems great in a way. That's like, okay, well, so reversal of dominance is this really powerful mechanism. That's very helpful for trying to explain. It gives us a way that we can get this balancing selection to work. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a problem when you look at the genomic scale, which is that you can't just treat these loci as independent. Their fitness effects have to be added up to get overall organism fitness. And in particular, if you just keep accumulating beneficial mutations, you're going to start hitting diminishing returns. And so that means you sort of have an overall budget of how much fitness you're allowed. And if you're balancing a ton of really weak effect alleles, your sort of fitness budget is going to be used up by weakly oscillating polymorphisms, and it's hard to see how you're going to have, a large number of big effect oscillating polymorphisms on top of that. So it's kind of like diminishing returns epistasis allows too much riffraff in, and you'll struggle in models to get a lot of large effect oscillating polymorphisms in this way. Whereas all the other mechanisms like protection from selection, they don't allow the riff wrapping, they only allow large effect stuff, but we need strong selection for that. So, to summarize the situation, you need strong selection, as I've said. I should mention that the selection coefficients of about 10%, sorry, if you just look back here, you can see some of these guys are oscillating at about the magnitude that we would expect, although some of them are a lot larger. So we need probably selection that's a bit too strong, so it seems like protection from selection type mechanisms are not going to do it alone. On the other hand, reversible dominance has this issue that it's not discriminatory enough in the presence of diminishing returns epistasis. There's also a question of why reversible dominance in that way that can be so prevalent that you get so many loci that are stabilized by that. And so my sort of tentative question or conclusion from all of this is maybe we need some kind of a mix of very weak reversible dominance, which would be easier to explain why that might occur, combined with the other mechanisms to give you this more selective choice of large effect oscillating polymorphisms. I'd be interested to talk to people more about that offline. So I'm going to briefly end off with the part of my title that I haven't mentioned at all yet. And this is where things get really weird and complicated, and I'd love to hear ideas. We're just looking at these frequency oscillations, but the reality of what's going on in the population is these crazy cycles of population growth and collapse in the summer and the winter. And this opens up all sorts of density-dependent effects, which opens up the possibility that you have stable polymorphism in the normal sense, not driven by the fluctuations, but just stable polymorphism driven by the usual trade-off between R and K and that kind of thing, where the frequency oscillations are imposed on top of that by other factors. And it also opens up ways that you can get stable polymorphism from the moods and bus cycles themselves. So in this example that I've shown here, you can imagine that the type that's favored in the summer is sort of an R strategist, and so selection favoring it gets weaker as density increases. And because it races to hit parent capacity faster than the winter allele, it'll get fewer generations of selection favoring itself in the summer if it's common compared to if it's rare. And so I probably don't have time to fully explain this, but this is just sort of an example of how this far from equilibrium demography can give you some really weird and interesting ways you can get polymorphism. Although I will mention that all of these also seem to have a similar property as protection from selection, that is they require a strong selection to work. I'd be interested to hear any ideas that people have on this. So I'm just going to wrap up. Thank you for listening. If you want to read the paper where I discuss some of this, bottom there, and that's my co-author, Joanna Mason.